Hey everyone, I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast. Well, we are in an election year and political ads are everywhere. And as we get closer to November 2024, it is harder and harder to avoid.
and while you may think of math as a course that intersects with political topics, teachers may find it coming up in many ways.
So today we gathered a panel of lovely educators to give us advice on this and answer the question, should politics be avoided in math class?
First up is a Kentucky math educator who is working to improve mathematics from pre-K through college. He loves both hard rock and punk rock music and 80s and 90s pop and country music, keeping that Spotify algorithm on its toes. It's Dee Crisatelli. Hey, Dee.
Hi.
Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Sure. I live in Georgetown, Kentucky, and I work with a couple different Kentucky institutions, working on, as has already been said, math education from primary through college. I do some work with adult education and some work with the Kentucky Center for Mathematics out of Northern Kentucky University, but that has me all over the state, and I love it.
Awesome.
Lots of
Awesome.
teachers and students.
So, and now the question we ask all of our guests: when did math first become controversial to you?
I was a seventh grader, so it's been a minute. And it was because I didn't see math. I didn't see the numbers. I didn't see the equations the way that my poor seventh grade teacher saw them. I was very creative and I found much quicker ways to solve all the equations she was giving me, because I treated all those different pieces like objects and moved them around. And so I had always way fewer steps than she did. And my papers looked like she had blood on them because she was very much wed to doing it her way. And I eventually gave up being kind of cute and creative with things and did things her way. But I also I wasn't a great student for her the rest of that year, which was controversial for at my home, obviously, with my parents. But it was sort of a little bit of defiance that this is not what math is supposed to be. And it turns out I was right. And math is a very creative thing. And so I suffered through that year, and made some decisions that changed sort of the trajectory of my world and had to find my way back to math, from science because I had different plans at that point. And so the controversy is I changed my mind about a direction that maybe I didn't have to. I wasn't wrong.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And next up is a returning guest to this podcast, an educator, a dope human doing dope things in life and in work, who you can always count on her to ask, what do the students think? It's Crystal Watson. Welcome back, Crystal.
Thank you. Appreciate
Can,
you.
can you tell our listeners where you are, remind us where you are and what your current role is?
I am in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am a newly minted principal of a pre-K through 6 building right in the heart of Cincinnati here.
Very good. And now again, the question we ask all of our guests, when has math been controversial to you? I know you shared one story already.
Uh-huh. So the last time I was here, I shared the story of high school math, just kind of being tracked through middle school and high school math and ending up in remedial math at NKU, even though I thought that I was good. I wasn't like an A student, but I wasn't a D student either. But I'll bring up another story now. When I was starting to think about my students, we couldn't wrap our heads around transformations in 8th grade, right? And I was like, okay, what can I bring into the classroom that will make transformations real for me and for them? And when I started researching, there was a whole lot of, Desmos or GeoGebra, and those are all great. But I started researching, like, what can my students do sociopolitically to help them understand, like, how dire it is that they know math, right? So we did a transformations project around gentrification. So they learned about like gentrification and what the old Cincinnati looked like before the highway was put through the hood. And then why gentrification happens, what that means. And then they got the chance to build their own floor on an affordable high rise. And then they had to like tell us, why should we live on your floor? And they had to research like, what does it mean to be affordable? What is affordable and who needs affordability, right? So for me, that opened my eyes to the controversy of math. And it wasn't just me. I mean, I was on the internet perusing what other people were doing, and collectively, the collective work that has gone on in math education came up with this project. And my students were like, "Wow, I didn't." They even voiced that math is used to keep them from being liberated, from being free. And that's when it was like, okay, it really is controversial. It's past me having to take remedial math. Like it's really controversial out here. So that is, I still hold on to that.
Wow, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And finally, we have an educator who has been a public high school teacher in New York City for 12 years through the Math for America program. It actually started as Chris's student teacher way back in the day. When he's not teaching, he's playing board games or going to Broadway shows. It's Matt Baker. Hey, Matt, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Yeah. So I'm currently in Brooklyn still. I am a high school teacher, the chair of our department, and I also help out with some of the PD at school and still at MFA Math for America. So I really just interested in how teachers are learning and helping kids to learn, but specifically continuing our education. Um, when did math become controversial? I guess I have a couple answers, but I was thinking about these, and the first time I remember me finding math controversial myself was in third grade when we had to do estimation. It was the first and only time I've cried in math class was because it was so counter to how I thought about math. Like I liked that you could get an answer, and the fact that you just kind of looked at a jar of jelly beans and got something felt very counter to what I thought it should be. Which I think falls into a lot of why I still don't love probability, but I think it was a piece of it. So I think it's just like yeah, I think that was the first time it was controversial for me personally. But I also acknowledge that I was pretty lucky if that's the worst that it got. So
Very good. Thank you all. And with that, let's get into the debate. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have about 2 minutes to just share your thoughts on the question, should politics be avoided in math class? And Dee, you're up first.
Should politics be avoided in math class? I am asked a question. The question is, should politics be avoided in math class? And all I can think of is more questions. What counts as political? Who decides? Are the standards I'm building my lessons on political? Who had to sign off on them? Is having a picture of my family on my desk political? Is that true for all my colleagues? How do we determine which students take calculus? Is that process political? Is it political to serve as a sponsor for a student group? Does that depend on the student group? Who decides? What assessments am I preparing students to take? Who decides where these assessments come from? How many of these are there? Are these decisions political? Do my students see themselves in the curriculum we use? Is this question political? Is discussion of the 26th school shooting of this year involving injury or death a political activity? Is it less political to just ignore it? I am asked a question. Should politics be avoided in math class? How is that even possible?
Wow. Thank you, Dee.
You're welcome.
Next up is Crystal. Crystal, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
That was quite the poem, Dee. I love that. And you may hear some of your words in my opening because I'm sitting here writing while you're asking your questions. So the question of whether politics should be avoided or included in math. Math is not apolitical, so by design, politics cannot be avoided, right? Now, if you're thinking politics is who's going to be our latest president, or debating women's rights, or gay rights, or whatever hot topic is on everyone's minds, then we're thinking really shallow. Politics cannot be avoided because it permeates in every single part of our system in ways that continue to keep marginalized folks in the margins by gatekeeping, sorting, excluding, in a way that it was set up to do, to weed out the labored from the elite. And math is also something that is used to determine intelligence. If you are a math person, you're probably one of the smart ones, you're a nerd, whatever that might mean, right? If you are not good at math, then you're just something else, right? You might be creative, but being both doesn't make any sense in math, according to folks. I love Dee's question about who decides what is political. And that would be the question of the day for me. Who decides? That's what makes it political, is that every single thing within math, within education, within our democratic system encourages others to hold the power without including our students, our teachers, our communities, our folks that have lived experiences, because we are so used to doing things to and for them instead of with them, which makes it even more violent, I would say. So it is unavoidable. We have to make sure that we are cognizant of the politics that keep our students marginalized and avoid perpetuating that so that they can once become liberated.
Okay, thank you. We're hitting hard here. And last but not least, Matt, you have your 2 minutes and your time begins now.
My short, unnuanced response is no, politics should not be avoided in math class. To quote Paulo Freire, apologies if I mispronounced his last name, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he says there's no such thing as a neutral education. Politics decides what topics we get to teach in the classroom. It decides what words we're allowed to say in the classroom, and it often decides what people even get to be in the classroom. And the second part of that Freire quote is education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. Throughout our history, marginalized groups have fought for education because it's so powerful politically. As a citizen of this country, I want my fellow citizens to be informed about what's happening because that will make them more engaged and more powerful in their own communities. And I want to give them time to understand the things that affect them and the tools to help them make educated choices that change those things that affect them. And I think the biggest argument that education is already political, picking up what the two others have said, is that how much effort is being put into dismantling public education as we are sitting here right now. I completely understand why some teachers have to avoid politics in the classroom because they need to keep their jobs, because that's the stakes of some of these conversations. I think one of my biggest frustrations, however, is what gets labeled as politics and what doesn't. Like if you went to any history class and taught about how the founding fathers broke from England because of freedom, there are a number of people who'd be like, oh yeah, that's exactly right. But that specific interpretation is a political reinterpretation of what actually happened. And when teachers are asked to avoid politics, what that actually means is avoid pronouns or avoid slavery or even avoid discomfort, which was the text in a law that was passed. They're told to avoid certain politics, and it's often the politics that affect the students in my inner city public school. I think one of the powers of math is that we try to make sense of problems while attending to precision. We can look at a data set or a map and try to make a model of what's happening. We can create viable critiques of the models of others. I don't advocate that math classes should be a place to campaign for a specific candidate or even a specific cause, but my whole point is that pushing a specific political agenda is wrong. That said, math class is a place of logic, and I think we have a lot of problems that need some very logical solutions at the moment.
Wow, thank you all so much. You've already hit us pretty heavy and given us a lot to think about already. Mic drops 3 times, pick them back up and drop them again. So where I think I want to start, because I heard all three of you say it, and I want to make sure that our listeners are very clear. When we are talking about avoiding politics and math, are we talking about avoiding talking about the presidential election? Are we, are we, how are we, how are we avoiding politics? Are we talking about the presidential election solely? I mean, I know Crystal talked about like that's only surface level. Let's go a little bit deeper into what that truly means. Even more so because we've already kind of touched on it for your 2 minutes, but I want to make sure that our listeners really hear because I don't want anybody to think that it's solely about this upcoming election. Crystal, you want to start?
Sure. Is it relevant? Absolutely. But I feel like who the president is going to be is going to be kind of like a side conversation to the mathematics that goes into an election, right? I think thoughtful teachers and thoughtful educators, they want a democracy, right? So we live in a democracy. We want our kids to be able to freely make their choices and things like that. I've seen things on social media where folks hold mock elections, right? And they get to vote for whomever they want to vote for or whatever. But to me, the mathematics behind elections, so you can do so much. You can do exponentials, you can do probability, you can do basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, you can do fractions, you can do all types of stuff mathematically as it pertains to the election, right? And I think it goes beyond whether it's a Kamala or a Donald, right? I don't think that really matters. At least it wouldn't to me. What matters to me is students being able to walk out of my classroom or out of a classroom and understand how their vote is it matters. It matters numerically, it matters philosophically, it matters politically, it matters all of those things. But at the end of the day, I think it provides a real world situation that every student would be able to access because they live in this country. And voting and politics is like it permeates everything that we do.
Yeah, I want to add a layer to this for Dee and Matt.
Yeah.
So how can we take what Crystal just said and thinking about things like data literacy and and where how does that fit into like the political landscape of a math classroom?
I'm just thinking in Kentucky, most of the voting centers are schools. So it's intricately tied, right? Like you can't pretend there's nothing political happening, school's closed, and voting is happening in those places instead. So students know this is happening from kindergarten through, 12th grade. They know this is happening. One of the ways to sort of connect it to that is the fact that we can look in any of our states. Mine is specific, to Kentucky. The number of voting centers for a county, there are 120 counties in my state. They're wildly different, vastly different, disparate, different numbers of voting centers, right, available for folks. I live in a small, very small city, but in a mostly rural county, lots of voting centers, multiple places where I can go vote within a 5-mile radius of my house, right? And then there are fewer voting centers in some of the larger cities per, if you start looking at that per population numbers, those ratios are not ratioing well. In terms of that math. And so it's really easy to see because when you see the pictures in the evening news and on all the social medias of the lines at some of those places, those lines are deliberate. And there's no way to not know that, right? Because I've never had to wait to vote in the county where I currently live, right? I've never had to wait, right? There's no reason for that. And students know, even elementary school students, because they go wait with their family members to vote, right? And so that's math that's really clear, right? Because time is a commodity. and they can see.
What's so frustrating about this, not the fact that we're having this conversation, but the argument about avoiding politics, is just like the math that shows that things are inequitable is not like Calc 3. Like it's not AP stats. It's like sixth graders can look at the fact that these ratios do not make sense, and like I don't have to do anything crazy. I just have to pull up the percentage of, I don't know, African American people in the country and then the percentage of African American people in jail, and those numbers are wildly different. And it's like I'm not playing with the numbers. I'm not pushing an agenda. I'm just showing you two facts that happen to be true at the same time. And like the moral need to do something about that is like a much more complicated conversation than I think we have, but it's just like I I think going back to some of what we were saying in our opening statements, like the need to get rid of politics in the classroom, like why do you want to get rid of politics in the classroom? Is it because it's making you look at things that are really uncomfortable and like maybe need to change? Like if you're coming in and saying this isn't okay, I'm just thinking about the why, I guess, which is sort of a tangent from what we were asking, but I just like because the math is so obvious and not complicated, then the arguments are become weaker, and so therefore there has to be some other reason for them.
So let me jump in here. So let's just say that you are in a state or a school where you're allowed to get into some of this a little bit controversial stuff. Let's just like take the admin restrictions or the you know the I don't know, congressional restrictions or whatever of your state off for a second. Like, let's suppose you have that freedom. What advice do you have to get started? Like, how do you make students feel safe in a discussion where they might have different opinions, and how do you like facilitate that conversation? Like, what any advice at all you have on just like how you could make that run? And let's start with D.
If, oh my gosh, I want that world very much that you just described. I think it's really easy to find things that make for good conversations with students. Crystal already talked about the how can we make our world better with math opportunities, right? If we could do this, if we could design the perfect space, let's do it. So I think those kinds of activities are a nice place to start. I think comparing, she talked about Cincinnati and the map before and after. I got Louisville here where I can have a really good, clear, good conversation and talk about redlining what that looked like before, what that looks like now. There's a heat map that shows this is the consequences. These are the consequences for some of the actions that were taken. It happens to tie into the number of voting places. Like you can tie all that together. But one of the key ways I think to do that is to think about it in terms of, and what are we going to do about it? Because I think it has to be tied to the how do we make this my community better, right? So if I'm working with a teacher in a school, we can look at just a certain radius around the school, right? And look at the maps and look at the what's available and what's not available for families and think about it in terms of, so if we had a way, right, to do something, and often there is a small thing that can be done, right? We learn some things about the history of this neighborhood. We learned some math about some of the things that happened along the way, and we learned some math in finding a solution to a problem. And that is what that's definitely what I would do and try to do in little spaces where I can.
Yeah, how about Matt? Do you want to add anything about how you facilitate or help students feel safe in a somewhat difficult conversation, or just a possibly like they'll be disagreeing with some classmates or something?
I mean, I think the first step is building community. Are we allowed to name drop resources online? Like
Sure.
if you watch, there's a website called Facing History and Ourselves, and they have a really fantastic, like, whole like mini course you can take about how to discuss current events with students. And like the very first thing is first start with yourself. So figure out all the stuff you have going on before you bring it up in front of children, because you cannot be up there when the kids ask a tough question and respond. Like you have to be the, not, I won't even say adult because adults can't do this. Like you have to be the facilitator. Um, and like And then it's also like, how do you build community? And like you can't just walk into any classroom and start having a conversation about anything. Like you need to get the kids to trust you. You need to get the kids to trust each other. You need to teach them how to have a conversation that's tough and how to disagree respectfully, which again, a lot of adults can't do anymore. And like it's like I think there's this desire like, oh, this thing just happened. I really want to talk about it with my kids because I know what's bothering my kids. But like, you actually could be doing more harm if you're not taking some of those steps. And I think a lot of good teachers do that stuff already at the start of the year, even if we're just talking about slope and I don't know, solving equations. Like a lot of teachers do those things, but there is just an extra level of intentionality to having those conversations. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I love what both of them are saying and all of that, and plus, just something a little, just a tangible piece. So I don't think any of it can be done without building that community, right? And making sure that students feel like they belong in the space. And by belong, I mean they are allowed to have an opinion. They are allowed to advocate for themselves. They are allowed to speak on things that they have experience in, right? So we're allowing students to do that so that they do feel belonging, so that they do feel a part of the community, so that we can have conversations, right? But I think the most tangible thing that I did in the classroom, and I still do this, I still do this, literally doing this with my students, new students, they do not know me from anybody, right? I've been their principal for all of 17 days. Um, no, 30. Oh my gosh, it's 30 days. Anyway, 30 days. And they, I ask first for individual reflection, right? What means something to you? What is really important to you, right? And what does it mean to you to either help or harm? Whatever it is that means something to you, right? So a lot of my kids, they'll come up with like my family, right? And I'll say, what does it mean to you to help your family? Well, I want to go to school. I want to graduate. I want to get a good job because I want to be able to help take care of my family or whatever, right? So it might be something monetary. So then we talk about jobs. We talk about wage gaps. We talk about all these things, right? So me personally, I always go to the kids. I always ask the kids. I don't remember past maybe my first year of teaching ever planning an entire lesson without talking to some kids. Because to me, if you don't, back to what Dee was saying earlier about seeing yourself in the curriculum, there is not a curriculum out here that is written, I can tell you, that will make every kid see themselves in it. It's just not there, right? So in an attempt to make even the greatest curriculum that is out there, that everybody uses, and it's rigorous and all these other things, to make it responsive, reflective, sustaining, all of those those cultural things that we want, we've got to bring in the voices of kids, and we've got to plan with them and not for them and to them. So that's really what I always hang my hat on that. Like, have you even asked the kids what they want to learn about? Have you asked them what they want to talk about? I'm sure before you go into a debate, Chris, when you were in the classroom, you didn't just come up with some debate topic. The kids were probably already talking about it. There was maybe a heated discussion. So then you set it up, like you're not just going to come in with some random topic and be like, okay, today we're going to get heated with each other today about this topic that you've never heard of. And, like you build that up. So I would highly suggest some individual reflection, then maybe some paired talking to where they talk to each other about their thoughts, and then bringing two pairs together and making it a group of 4, and they're talking about their thoughts. And then you can start to plan what you're going to do whole group, so that everybody feels a part of that community.
So
go ahead, man.
Crystal mentioned something about uh, having an opinion and that it's okay to have an opinion. And I think one of the things that comes up a lot in these conversations is that like teachers are indoctrinating the children. And it's like, no, I don't, like, you can have a completely different opinion than me. That's great. Like, that's amazing and an interesting time. And like, honestly, I'd rather be teaching my kids how to share different opinions than get them all on board with my opinion, which I've been wrong many a time before. So like, I just think I want to really highlight the fact that like it's most of the teachers I know are not out here trying to get a bunch of little soldiers for the cause. We're just trying to get kids to think and have a debate about their thoughts, and they can have, and like, I guess we value the difference of opinion, and I think that sometimes gets lost in this belief that like the actual reality is maybe that we're just showing kids some basic facts and they're coming to a moral judgment, and there's a different moral judgment than maybe the people in their lives, and that's really hard. And I don't want to dismiss that, but like that doesn't mean we're indoctrinating them to believe a specific thing.
Right.
And I think
Yeah,
part of
and
what makes this political, sorry, is that the world isn't actually just black or white. Like there's so many things in between. And that's part of what makes this whole discussion interesting for us is we all see that, right? And the goal is to help our students see that.
yeah, and thinking back to like what Matt was saying too, it's not about, we're not trying to indoctrinate anybody. We're trying to get kids to have an opinion. But I think even more important is have your opinion, but have reasoning.
Yeah.
Like actually know what you're saying and why you believe what you believe. I mean, I remember teaching in 2016 and during that election, and the entire time my students had no idea who I was voting for, because every time they bring something up, I would say, well, why do you believe that? Like, I mean, from the lock her up to he's the worst human in the world, like, why do you believe that? And if you can't tell me that, okay, then you need to go and try to figure out why you believe that. And it can't be because mom and dad told me. Like,
Mm.
you need to be able to come to me with something. And like in terms of politics in the classroom, for me, I know this is like outside of what we typically do. We don't really just facilitate, but um, but for me, it's like not just having them have an opinion, but know why. Why do you believe that, and lean into that. So
Yes.
good, Chris.
So what I'm hearing is we should all be using debate math stuff in the classroom. So a little plug for me there.
Yes.
um, yes, but
Articulating arguments and justifying our reasoning
yeah,
also sounds like a math practice. This
it
is
also sounds
great.
like a math practice. Yes. Also sounds like things we do in like writing proofs and justifying our work, like all that stuff. Yes.
And
Okay.
across every content area,
Truth.
like literally every content area, we do this. But go ahead.
But I want to jump to the other side now. So suppose a teacher is in a not so friendly environment. I do a lot of traveling with my work. I work with teachers all over the US and Canada, and some teachers have told me they can't look at a graph that is at all related to the election. There's a mandate from the school or the school board or admin or whatever that like you cannot touch like current event politics, election politics, or you may get fired. And so, what advice do you have for someone who is in this like more extreme circumstance to like navigate that? And Dee, you brought up like even like a picture of my family might be political in some context, right? So like, how do I navigate these weird restrictions and try to be as fair and keep my job as possible while also like doing what I want is best for students? Go ahead, Maddie.
I'll admit to struggling with that because what you see is what you get with this girl. And so I struggle mightily with that. I mean, I've kept a job over and over and over again. But I push right up to the line on a regular basis. I've learned to ask for forgiveness where absolutely necessary, and it's not often. I think I've probably been lucky in that way. Um, I think there are places I make decisions to not go. But there's plenty of good historical, so I can't use anything current. I can pull stuff that was been around for a while. Du Bois got some great maps from history that could tell all sorts of, and they also happen to be beautiful because we've determined I like artsy things. Those maps are beautiful, right? Great, pull them out, right? They are a snapshot of a moment in time. They're a truth from a moment in time. The household furniture, right? And black households and one point in history. That is an amazing story. That is a good data story since some of this ties pretty cleanly to data. So you can do all sorts of math with that in a math class. Um, and, and that's a fair conversation because that is a snapshot of a moment in time that has some direct connections to today, right? What might be some of those corollaries? Let students talk about what, what that means, and it doesn't touch the presidential election and the crazy extremes that we currently have going, but addresses some specific things that are important historical political moments in this country's history that matter. So I can go to things that aren't current if I've been told I can't do current. I've got some other really cool mathy things I can pull from the past.
Yeah, one of my norms is always know when to step forward and step back, so I jump in too much. I think that there are ways to do it subtly. So there's a website called Skew the Script, which is good for Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and some stat stuff. And like there's a lesson, like I'm doing a lesson on Thursday that's like it's about sampling bias, but the thing we're sampling just happens to be a map of housing income in a city, and the city just like when you look at the city and it lists race. I think there's ways to like have that conversation where it's not the focus of the conversation, but maybe a kid asks a question. I think the first thing I want to say is though, like all of this is important, and I believe very deeply that we should be having political conversations, but I also believe that people need to take care of themselves. And I think like if you are in a position where you know for a fact you cannot bring up some of this stuff, then I think you don't and you keep your job, because also if you're at a place where you want to bring up this stuff, you are probably doing so many other things in your community that help so many of these children that are from marginalized or minoritized identities. Like you are helping in other ways that are maybe less look at this lesson I did, but that are still super valuable, and I think that a lot of the kids can see. So I guess that's it, it's a it doesn't always it's not always obvious, I guess, which doesn't feel good in this age of social media and like what can you put on
Yeah.
Instagram. But I think like you can still do good even if it's not a giant slide on your board.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just want to take a moment and honor those that are in a position where they feel like it's impossible, like they're only surviving right now, right? So they feel silence, they feel like, they can't be creative in the classroom. We're going back to, sitting kids in rows and making them, um, just do rote memorization or whatever, and not really making it relevant or real. I just want to say that there are people out there that feel like, if you're not doing something, then you just don't want to. It's a choice. It is a choice. Everybody has choices, but not everybody has a choice that is going to leave them in a space to be able to take care of themselves, like Matt was saying. So I just wanted to take a moment to honor that. But I agree with both. I am very lucky to be in a district that we have an equity policy, we have an anti-racism policy, we have all types of policies. So we are allowed. Now, there might be a time, I live in Ohio, so there might be a time where, our big red state comes down and says, you can't, you can't, you can't. And I've thought about that. And fortunately, I have the privilege of um, having other credentials that I can just go. I can go somewhere else if I don't feel like I want to work in a school system. I could do something revolutionary. I could do something, abolitionist from that standpoint. But a lot of folks can't take that risk, and that's okay. So I agree with the start small, right? And why do we have to talk about the election if we're just talking about one thing that political folks care about is their democracy. So turn it around to how do you become a patriot? Like how do you maintain patriotism and maintain our democracy? You vote, and yeah, and just teach them about the system of voting, right? Which is very mathematical. It doesn't matter if it's Elmo and Cookie Monster. If and it's funny to me that I hear folks say we can't talk about voting or politics or whatever, but they vote for class presidents, they vote for the prom queen and king and all of that. Like we can vote for all of that, right? And a lot of that is political, right? Because
Those are political.
Yes, because we are political. But it's only a problem when we're using politics in the classroom that don't agree with your politics, right? So I go back to what Rob was saying, like, our kids don't need to know where our stance is. We need to be the facilitators to let them talk about what is important to them. And it might not even be the presidency. They might care about, what voting about what kind of ice cream they're going to serve at the fair or whatever. I don't know, but it could just be anything.
Drake and Kendrick.
Right? Yeah, and I'm like,
Drake and Kendrick.
Right? Drake or Kendrick. We could go there too. Yes. Although it's diabolical that Kendrick is going to be at the Super Bowl. I was like a whole entire arena saying, "Oh, behold." It's terrible, but we'll see what happens.
Well, Crystal, if anything happens to you in Cincinnati, you can come to Pittsburgh. I will scoop you up in a heartbeat. That is fact.
I appreciate you, Rob.
So I wanted to go a little bit deeper into for my last question, talking about data, because I think back to what Dee said at the beginning, and she asked all these questions. Is that political? Is that political? And every single time you ask the question before you ask, is that political? I was like, yeah, yes, yes. So I started to think about data and using data as a vehicle for students to talk about opinions and question and develop ideas. I think about how important that is, and I wanted to hear all three of you kind of talk about that. And before that, I wanted to kind of call back to, I remember seeing a graph during the beginning of COVID from a news outlet in Georgia, and they were talking about how the COVID numbers were going down, and they flashed it on the screen. They pulled it down. They said the COVID numbers are going down. This thing's fake. But I paused it and I looked, and it was not chronological order. So just like being data literate, you're able to pick up on the x-axis was not chronological order. So, thinking about things like that and thinking about things like what's going on in this graph, like where rich conversations can happen, taking it away from the presidential election itself and just thinking about the politics that are this country. How else can we, really focus on data literacy, and why is data literacy so important?
It's important because they and we are inundated with data all day, every day. Much of it being thrown at us by people who have an agenda, right? Like just about everybody giving you data has an agenda, right? It's to sell you something, to sell you an idea, to sell you a product, right? To misinform. It is often to misinform, right? It should be for information, and sometimes it is, right?
Mhm.
But often it is not. And so being able to understand what are good data sources are better, I'm going to say better, right? Because there are no perfect, it's like that perfect, that, nebulous perfect curriculum. There is no perfect data source either, because everyone's got an agenda of some variety. But it goes back to the who decides what information gets shared, right? I've always got a question. That is my shtick. I always have a question, right? I get myself in trouble with the questions more often than not. But that it is who decides where the information is flowing from, right? What data points we selected, right? We don't even have to be looking at the polls about various parts and issues to the election. We don't have to think about the candidates. You just think about issues that matter to people in this country. And I go back to part of the data literacy for me is how did they lump together the age categories? Like I want a whole thing about that, because I've hit the age demographic where I am lumped with people much older than me, and it makes no sense to me, because I am like the life experience of a 45-year-old is not the same as a 65-year-old. And they sometimes squish big swaths of people together, right, in order to keep the youngins together. And because we keep getting older, and they won't separate that older, like you get 75 and up, Well, 75 is not the same as 95 either.
Right.
And so like just knowing who we're asking these questions of, all the demographic information, the gender breakdowns and all those sorts of things, that's not what they share with us. You have to go into the tabs. They don't share those tabs easily, right? But you can find them, right? But then you got to learn how to do that information. And so it's just knowing what got filtered to us, right? And just having students know the data that they get more often than not has been filtered in some way. Who did that filtering?
I love that. That's why, that's why I love slow reveal graphs. Shout out to Jenna. Um, slow reveal graphs has it really changed my thought process on graphs and data, and just how to present it in a way that students can consume but also construct, right? So slow reveal, that could be something that folks that are in states that are not very, or counties or whatever that are not very, um, don't allow the creativity there. Slow reveal graphs could be good. And then kids could be looking at data on their own time and be like, oh, this is that skill that I learned when we did, graphs or whatever. Because then for those listeners that have not looked at slow reveal graphs, what happens is you get pieces of the graph at each point, and at each point you're asking the students to think about what could this part of the graph represent, right? So I think about this when I teach algebra too, right? So when you're giving linear equations, or you're giving exponential equations or whatever, there's a lot of curricula that ask you to ask the students, what could this represent, right? And so students construct that themselves. And then that's a good way to get to know what's important to them too. So they might say, they might talk about something deeper or political, but they might not, right? And that's okay, because you're teaching them the skill of data, of reading data, of constructing data, of understanding data, and how data can be misleading, right? So that they can take that and they can use that in other places that do have higher stakes, right? Whether it be political or not.
Calorie intakes of common orders at Taco Bell, right?
Yep.
That was an amazing one.
Yep.
That could be a political conversation if someone says something that leads you in that direction about food choices. But
Yep.
it also could just be oh, I had no idea. Yeah.
Yep.
I also think in history class, like I was talking to a history teacher once, and there's this acronym called OPCV. I looked it up on my phone, OPCVL, and it's origin, purpose, content, value, limitations. And it's like the things you look at in a historical text to sort of figure out where it's coming from. So obviously, if you're reading like a speech from Winston Churchill, that the background of that is going to be different than a speech from someone from West Germany or East Germany, right? So like having those skills of interpreting texts is a thing that they do in history class and even do in English class, but we don't do so often in math class, right? So I think having kids think about where this data is coming from, who's publishing it, and why they're publishing it, and like what are the limitations of it. And I think just reiterating to kids the fact that like the fact that people are so uncomfortable with math is actually used as a weapon to keep like in that regard, where it's like people know that if they throw up a chart, it will intimidate people because they felt nervous about math class, so therefore they just sort of trust it. Like there's this trust of numbers in a way that there's not this trust of words. And I think explaining to kids that like you may disagree with whatever, but like at least understand where the numbers are coming from. And like even if you do agree with the numbers, understand where the numbers are coming from, because like on both sides across the political spectrum, whatever, like it's really easy for people to see a chart and be like, oh, okay, this says what I want it to believe, so it must be true. And then it's like confirmation bias is a thing across. So like how can we teaching kids to be curious is a really important piece in that regard too.
Yes, that's why I don't like pie charts. I hate pie charts because the eye goes to the bigger piece. And if it says what you want it to say, then you just run with it. And there's been tons of scholars that have said, like data scholars that have said, stop using pie charts because they're not accurate. and they don't give the data that you think it's giving, right? So that's the reason why I hate pie charts, because I think that people's eyes just go towards the biggest piece, the smallest piece, and oh yeah, that goes along with what I believe. So I'm gonna use this. Yeah, I love that, Matt. I love what you
Yes.
just
Never mind that the next two together are much more than that larger piece, and maybe
Yes.
that's the conversation we should be having.
exactly. Yeah.
Or even just the way we talk about numbers, like 2 out of 5 doesn't sound as crazy as 40%. Like they just sound different to me,
Yep.
and they're the same thing, right? Like just that understanding of what ratios mean in the different ways. Like doesn't you have, there's just so many things about math that make kids uncomfortable, and we need to lean into that because that's the interesting stuff.
Yes. Okay. So I think I'm just going to ask one last question, and this is where we'll end the debate on. I just thinking about the future and with hope and promise of a great future for our education system. I'm just wondering, what's one thing that you would change in regards to like how we deal with politics and current events, in whether it's adding more of something, less of something, like what's just one thing you wish for schools in your ideal, your dream for how we address politics and school in math class?
I would say that it is, and it's something I'm working towards, so I'm hoping to make this world possible. The realization that the needs that students have, in terms of like the political needs of communities for both urban and rural kids, much of what they need is exactly the same. We
Yeah.
spend so much time sort of dividing those communities, when in reality, right, kids are kids are kids, right? The standards are the same across my entire state. Kids are responsible for those. The teachers are responsible for those all across the state. Like there's more, we're more alike than not. There's a whole political movement that started with one candidate, hood to the holler, that speaks to me in so many ways, because the political needs of communities in Kentucky are all of those things are related. Both the hoods, right, and the hollers got neglected, continue to be neglected. And so my hope is that we use real data about what's happening in those communities to make those communities better and involve the folks living there in that work. I came from Holler, like that's where I came from. Um, that work is important. I went voting with my dad as a child in the Union Hall because he was a coal miner, right? Though those things matter. Kids are more alike than not. The needs of teachers really are more alike than not, and we need to do the work to make those spaces better.
My hope for education is that, again, and I know I've said this a couple times, even on this episode, is that we stop doing things to and for communities and kids and teachers, and we start doing things with them. And that's really to politicians. Like, stop making decisions that affect multiple folks, right? Rungs of folks underneath you, based on the loudest constituent, right? So really get into the communities and understand exactly what each community needs. That's what annoys me about like blanket policies, or because Chris can tell you this, Cincinnati is much different than like say a Delaware, Ohio, or even Columbus. Like we have similarities, but the needs of our students are going to be different based on their geographic and their socio-political context and all of that, right? Cincinnati is in a tri-state. We go over the bridge and we're in Kentucky. So they have to understand, like, though we're very liberal when it comes to politics in Cincinnati, you go across the bridge and it's something totally different, right? So for me, I would love for folks to stop making blanket policies and allow communities to speak up for what they need, and help in that planning, help in co-construct curriculum, co-construct standards, co-construct a vision, right? And we say that we want to do that. And even in our standards, when you get into admin, right? When you're in admin and you're looking at your your little matrix or whatever for your evaluation, it even says like co-construct a vision and a mission with your community. I cannot tell you the last time that I have seen an admin sit down with their community to construct a vision, other than maybe like a few lead teachers. But there are no students in there, especially if you're in elementary. They feel like elementary kids have nothing to say. And I'm like, you know how many things I learn from elementary kids every single day? And elementary kids experiencing poverty, experiencing mental health issues, experiencing trauma, experiencing watching folks getting shot in their communities each day. I mean, just all types of stuff, right? But they still are able to contribute because they know what they want, and they know what they, not always what they need. Sometimes they need to be led there, right? So if I'm 5, maybe I don't know what I need, but I know when I'm hungry. I know when I'm thirsty. I know when I need to go to the restroom. So if I can tell you all of those things, I can tell you about what makes me feel a certain way, or how my community makes me feel, or what would make me feel safe in my community. Those types of things we can ask kids. It's at this point it's a choice, because we have so many ways, right? Technology allows us to do things virtually. We can go into communities. There's all different types of ways. So there is no excuse. It is a choice. If we're still doing things to and for folks, it's a choice.
I think the piece in the longer term, I think I want more teachers involved in these conversations outside of just teacher spaces. So like teachers running for office, teachers on politics podcast. I listen to so many politics podcasts, and the amount of times they talk about education, and none of them have been in a public school classroom since they were public. And even if they often didn't go to public school, like it, I just want more teachers involved in these conversations who can say, no, that's actually not what's happening. Because it's very like what I hear and what I see are different universes. I think on a more short-term personal level, I think I want more resources that give us space to debate both sides of a topic. Because a lot of the things I mean like in the teaching classroom, so like a data set that lets me have kids argue both sides, even if you don't believe it. Like, how do we let's argue, use the same data set to argue two completely different opinions. And I am not smart enough to do that, but I think that there are a place for that to happen. And that's a thing I hunger for. And I wish we had more, I wish stats was more of a topic than factoring quadratics. I love factoring quadratics, but just like, it seems like our priorities are in the wrong place.
Wow, thank you all. That concludes this amazing discussion. Uh, you've given our listeners so much to think about. You've taught me so much in just this short little hour we've been together. I can't thank you enough for all that you've shared.
And now, for our listeners, as always, um, take this conversation with you. Take it out into, not just in your with your colleagues. Take it out into the community a little bit. Have this conversation and educate them, and hear what they have to say as well, to continue the conversation, because this is an important conversation. Um, always, but now more than ever, because the more we learn, we have to keep having these conversations, and hopefully we can start to make some change through mathematics. Be sure to go to our Twitter or X at Debate Math Pod to share your thoughts on this debate and what resonated with you.
And again, huge thanks to the three of you for all of your thoughtful sharing. Again, you hit the ground running with mic drops from the opening statements on, and so I've enjoyed listening to all of your brilliance, and I have learned a lot from you, all three of you.
Yeah, this is a really important topic. Thank you so much for bringing it to the surface.
For having
And
it.
thanks to all who are listening, and we hope you enjoyed and learned from this. And as we wrap up, Dee, where can listeners find you?
I am D Crescitelli, the letter D, Crescittelli at all the socials. I'm on all of them. You can find me there.
And we'll put it all in our show notes. And Crystal, where can listeners find you?
Yep, I'm Crystal M. Watson on all socials. and crystalmwatson.com. Yeah.
And Matt, where can listeners find you?
I have the annoying handle. It's Stoodle, Stoodle. Long before I thought I'd be ever become a teacher, I have regrets. But no. So it's on all the socials. And then on Instagram, actually not on Instagram. On Instagram, it's Mr. Baker's math class. But
Wonderful. Again, thank you all.